The last couple of weeks have been fairly slow in terms of video game news, and the main reason for that has been the Tokyo Game Show, and in the run-up to that, a number of showcases including PlayStation State of Play, ID at Xbox, there was a Nintendo Direct as well, and several other showcases. That didn't stop things happening in the background though, because there was a massive hack of Rockstar Games, which leaked a lot of information about Grand Theft Auto 6. There was a seemingly accidental leak of footage from a beta of Diablo 4, and there was a YouTuber who outed himself as the real insider, the guy who leaked a bunch of information about Ubisoft's upcoming Assassin's Creed titles. And all of that just goes to show that no matter what is happening in the foreground, events continue to tick over, things do move and change in the background. Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome to Gosu News, your regular dose of choice cuts and hot takes from the world of video game news. And as I promised last week, today we're going to start off with stuff from the Tokyo Game Show. This year's was a bit of a strange one, but possibly not for the reasons that you would first envision. Like every major event these days, the Tokyo Game Show was a mixture of pre-recorded showcases and special programs along with live streams that were sometimes 5-6 hours long. There were lots of release dates for upcoming games, but not that many new IPs got announced. There are probably several reasons for that, but I would speculate that the major reason is because a lot of titles are being pushed back to early 2023, which means that early 2023 is going to be very similar to early 2022. You remember what that was like? Now, if that's the case, it would be counterproductive for developers to announce new IPs when they have a window in which to give themselves more time to work on a project before announcing it. They essentially have more time to refine their ideas and concepts before presenting them to the public. There were a number of titles that were showcased in the run-up to the Tokyo Game Show, and because of that, they kind of lost their flavour when they were shown again as part of the big event. To give you an example, in the ID at Xbox there were a number of titles that were announced, but when it came to the Tokyo Game Show, there were only a few that actually caught my attention that I hadn't already talked about in the previous episode of Gosu News. One title that did stand out was Palworld, which is that Pokemon with Guns game that everyone has been looking forward to. That is looking to be a very interesting derivative of the Pokemon formula. Another one that caught my attention though was a game called Ukiyo, which is a story-based adventure set in cyberspace. The art style is what caught my attention for Ukiyo because it seems to reflect the art style of the Edo period in Japan. There were several re-releases and remasters announced, and some games that are already available on early access like Ghost Lore. Xbox also announced that The Legend of Sword and Fairy 7 is coming to Xbox, which I'm personally looking forward to. I have been following the Sword and Fairy franchise for a long time. Eiyuden Chronicles Rising and Eiyuden Chronicles 100 Heroes from 505 Games. They in particular caught my attention because I'm a big fan of Suikoden, and I was really pleased to see that Konami are slowly coming back into video games with the remasters of Suikoden 1 and 2. 505 Games also had Miasma Chronicles, which is something of an XCOM clone set in a post-apocalyptic America. Finally, there's Stray Blade, and I'm not too sure how I feel about Stray Blade because it is your classic action RPG. You're playing as an adventurer, you're exploring an ancient valley, you've got a wolf as a companion, and you basically have to unveil the history of the Forgotten Valley, master various powers, things like that. It seems on the surface a generic action RPG. I think a lot of the game and its success is going to hang on the story or the world building. Anyway, as I said, Konami announced Suikoden 1 and 2, the remaster. Another one that caught my attention from there, though, was a very stylish looking 360-degree top-down shoot-'em-up called Signy, All Guns Blazing. Now, the mechanics seem very, very familiar to anyone who's played Geometry Wars, but the actual game, the design of the bosses and the environments, I was hugely impressed by that. And I'm really looking forward to playing it because I've been looking for a good shoot-'em-up for a long, long time. SEGA and Atlus had a combined special program, let's call it, They had already announced all their Like a Dragon stuff the week before. There were more Persona remasters and re-releases. They had more information about Sonic Frontiers. The one that did stand out for me, though, from Sega and Atlus was Disgaea 7. And I'm a big fan of Disgaea. It should be fun. Which leads me to Koei Tecmo. The new Atelier game, Atelier Ryza 3, Alchemist of the End and the Secret Key. Koei Tecmo and Gust, when they do the Atelier games, they always do them as trilogies. And while that's broadly the tradition now, that's not a hard and fast rule, because we did have Atelier Lulua, the Scion of Ireland, and Atelier Sophie 2, the Alchemist of the Mysterious Dream. And there was also the town building of Nelke and the legendary alchemists, Ateliers of the New World. I am looking forward to the new Atelier game. I've been a massive fan of the Atelier franchise ever since the first Atelier game that I played, which was Atelier Iris, Eternal Mana on the PlayStation 2. After that, I went out and bought all of the previous Atelier games, imported them when I needed to. So yeah, I have basically all of them so far, and this is going straight in my collection. I'm looking forward to it. But that's not all that came from Koei Tecmo. We also had Fatal Frame Mask of the Lunar Eclipse. Now, I know that I did put some footage of Mask of the Lunar Eclipse in last week's episode because it was also announced as part of Nintendo's Direct, but I thought Tokyo Game Show's coming up, so I'll basically talk about it. It's a franchise that I have been a long time fan of. I'm glad they've reverted back to the Fatal Frame moniker, especially here in England, where they used to call the franchise by another name, Project Zero, which makes no sense because it doesn't reflect anything about the games themselves or the fact that you have to use a camera. Anyway, the final game that everyone was focused on from Koei Tecmo was Wolong Fallen Dynasty, and that's by Team Ninja. Now, before we go any further, I do want to point out that this is not a Dynasty Warriors game. Yes, it is set during the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and there are characters from that historical novel that do turn up in this game. And yes, it does have the word Dynasty in the title, but it's not a Dynasty Warriors game. In fact, it's more like Nioh, that samurai game that all of the fans of Onimusha said was very similar to Onimusha in a way, and all of the people who'd never played Onimusha but had only ever played Dark Souls said, hey, it's another Souls-like game. It's like the third chapter in that particular franchise, but doesn't have that moniker. Now, I'm actually curious about Wolong Fallen Dynasty because, aside from the way it plays and the fact that it's going to have one difficulty level, the fact that it's a darker, more horror-based take on Romance of the Three Kingdoms puts me in mind of other games that we have had announced over the last couple of years. Things like Black Myth Wukong, which is a darker, horror-based take on the Legend of the Monkey King, or Journey to the West if you want to call it that. There's also Wuchang Fallen Feathers, which I don't know a lot about, but I have seen the trailer of, and I do remember that did have more of a dark, supernatural, horror-based take on various Chinese mythological elements as well. So I am curious about Wolong Fallen Dynasty because of that, and I do like those sorts of games. Anyway, moving on to 505 games. I did mention them earlier during the Xbox stuff. A couple of the things that really stood out for me from them were Nivalis, which is a kind of a sequel, I suppose, to Cloudpunk, which I really like. It is set in a cyberpunk city, but this time you are taking control of a business. I'm curious about how that's going to work out. There were a couple of titles that grabbed me by the curiosity. Eden Gate, The Edge of Life. I'm not sure what the game's about. I am going to have to investigate more because I am curious. The other one was Unholy, which is basically a horror game. It wasn't the only horror game showcased at the Tokyo Game Show. Gamera Games also had Karma, The Dark World. The design of that game is phenomenal. It does look like you are actually going through a nightmare. That scene with the table where you have the giants stabbing their forks into the plates while these massive envelopes with the word Bill drop down from the sky, it's nightmare fuel. The strange thing is that Gamera Games kinda had the broadest selection of titles that caught my attention. Stuff like Ilia, a puzzle platform game using mirrors which is centered on several Chinese myths. Arto, where you basically paint the scenery and the colours work as part of the gameplay mechanic. In that respect, it's kind of like the Unfinished Swan crossed with Okami or Epic Mickey. I'm actually curious as to how Arto plays. An interesting one that I didn't really know about at all, called Wuji Daoren. I don't know what the English title is, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. It reminded me a lot of an ancient game from the Commodore Amiga called Budokan, where you had multiple different weapons and multiple different fighting styles, and you had to train in them to basically take part in a competition. Wuji Daoren is a lot more brutal than that because you are going around killing other characters with various martial arts and weapons. It does look like one of those games that's very much based in Chinese martial arts stories that were the foundation of a lot of these wire fu movies that were popularized at one point. Okay, moving on to Bandai Namco, and they continue to rely on big-name adaptations and tie-ins to generate the cash that they need so they can do other stuff like Elden Ring. Things like Dragon Ball and the new Sword Art Online game, another My Hero Academia game, more Idolmaster stuff, tons of it in fact, and loads of Gundam titles, and even a Lego game. They also had a few other things that stood out a little bit. Obviously, Klonoa is going to be one that I'm focused on because I'm a big fan of Klonoa. Ultra Kaiju Monster Farm, if they get the formula right, then it could be a nice little kaiju battler involving farming. And the big one, One Piece Odyssey, which has a story written by Oda Eiichiro. That, I think, is the one that a lot of people are going to be focused on, especially with the creator of One Piece writing the story himself, which means there are probably going to be lots of little Easter eggs within the game that hint at things that have happened within the main story itself, or hint at future things that are going to happen in the story. So expect this one to be examined closely by fans of One Piece. Moving on to Capcom, they did showcase a bunch of stuff about Resident Evil, another trailer for Exoprimal, which showed some gameplay and customization details. There was a whole bunch of stuff for Street Fighter 6, though. That was the big reveal for them. We now know the full starting roster, including the return of several classic characters like Dalsim and Blanca. There's more information on character customization, the world tour, exploration using abilities, the battle hub. Now, I just want to touch on something for a moment. When Shenmue 3 was in development, it hadn't come out yet, people hadn't realised just how bad a game that was going to end up being. In the run-up to that, I made the comment that Street Fighter or Tekken or another game of that ilk could do with a mode where you were a character wandering around learning martial arts and you could take part in these tournaments as a character that you created. Wouldn't that be fun? And the reason I came up with that idea was because it was actually a thing in the original two Shenmue games, where you could wander around and learn from different masters, and your proficiency with particular martial arts was based on how much you practiced, and you could go to like various empty parks and car parks and practice in those areas. And it seems like someone at Capcom has played Shenmue 1 and 2, and borrowed the idea that the character's combat style can come from masters they've trained with, and the proficiency with which they perform moves can be based on how much they've trained. They've taken that idea and run with it, and I hope it works really well here because it's an idea I'd love to see in more fighting games. I think it's something that fits with the fighting game model, and you can then tailor your own style of play based on the moves that you've learned. So you can have a character that has more of an MMA feel in a Street Fighter game or in a Tekken game. Now, wouldn't that be something? Speaking of Tekken, Bandai Namco did say that Tekken 8 is going to be a big change for the franchise, but we'll see how it's going to progress. Anyway, back to the Tokyo Game Show, and when you're talking about games from Japan, the only company that we haven't mentioned is Square Enix, and that's kind of because they had a lot of stuff that they were showcasing, but not much of it was stuff that we didn't already know about. So we already knew about Forspoken and Valkyrie Elysium, stuff like Star Ocean, The Divine Force, Romancing Saga, The Minstrel Song Remastered, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion, Voice of the Cards, The Beast of Burden, The Deofield Chronicle, and all sorts of other stuff like that. We already knew about a lot of the stuff that they were showcasing at the Tokyo Game Show, so there's nothing really I can add because there was nothing that really stood out. Obviously, Final Fantasy XVI is something I've got on my radar, but that's on everyone's radar. Okay, this being the roundup of the Tokyo Game Show, it wouldn't be complete without something from Genshin Impact developers MiHoYo, and their Hoyoverse presentation was actually quite interesting. They did talk more about things that were happening in Genshin Impact and also in Honkai Impact. They introduced Honkai Star Rail, which is a new turn-based strategy RPG from Hoyoverse. It's the latest addition to the Honkai series, and it introduces a standalone story with brand new characters. They also had more information about a couple of their other titles, like Tears of Themis, which is the husbando simulator, as people call it. But the other one from MiHoYo, or Hoyoverse, whichever one you want to call it, that caught my attention was Zenless Zone Zero, which is a new action RPG title. The video that they put out showcased some new information about the city in which the game's set, some boss battles, some new gameplay information, that sort of thing. I am actually curious about Zenless Zone Zero because I do want to see if MiHoYo can recreate the massive success of Genshin Impact with a new IP. So, watch this space. There are a couple of things that I want to mention about the Tokyo Game Show. One of the things that they do is this thing called Sense of Wonder Night, which is an event to discover new game ideas that catch people by surprise and give them a sense of wonder. Back in 2021, there were only 286 indie titles that entered the competition. This year, though, there were 583 titles that entered, 78 were selected to exhibit, and 8 finalists were broken into 2 parts. 4 representing a puzzle that speaks to something, interactive dialogue or token puzzles, and 4 representing conveying an unspoken message, which I interpret as what is the developer trying to say to their audience. So you can find out what those games are from the Tokyo Game Show website. They are available on there. I will link to them in the description below. A couple of oddities from the event, which just added to the strangeness. You had some hour-long presentations for specific games, like Samurai Maiden and things like that. And one of them was this Kirameki Paradise, or Life Makeover, from Arkasaw Games, the creators of Dragon Raja and Noah's Heart. And it is pronounced Dragon Raja because it's an Indian word for king. Raja, not Raha, as I've heard a lot of people pronouncing it for some reason. Anyway, it's a strange mobile game that looks like it was inspired a little bit by Toho and KDA, The Sims, and the dress-up games that inhabit niche areas of mobile gaming. It's powered by Unreal Engine, and the almost 50-minute presentation showcased the social lifestyle simulation game and focused on character, outfit, home and location customization and the social side of the game, which apparently will play a primary role. It's one of those games that's aimed at a very specific niche of Eastern and Western gaming, especially those people who are more focused on dress-up games, fashion-focused games, that sort of thing. I'm not part of that crowd. I just thought it's a bit of a strange one in terms of what you define as a game. I can see that a lot of people will prefer this type of game. It's very calm, very casual, there's no end-of-the-world stuff, there's no monsters to beat or anything like that. And that's some people's perfect type of game, and that's okay. I'm not criticizing anyone who wants to play this game because it's up to them. It just feels like a 50-minute presentation is a bit overkill for this type of game. Granted, there are various aspects of the customization part of the game that you can go into in more detail, because some of the refinements and some of the customizations, especially on the clothing side, are quite detailed. But the reason why Kirameki Paradise stood out as a particular oddity among all of the 50-minute presentations, things like One Piece Odyssey, Megaton Lab, Limbus Company, Samurai Maiden, all of those other games, were actual games, whereas Kirameki Paradise, Life Makeover, is more of an experience. I think the term social life simulation is quite accurate when you're talking about it, but when you think about the people who are going to be playing a social life simulation, the question I would ask is, are they the type of people who want to watch a 50-minute presentation about it, or do they just want a 10-minute presentation and then be allowed to explore it for themselves? And to be honest, I think for a lot of people, it would be the latter. But that's not the only oddity. Amazon Prime Gaming. I'm not sure what the point of their showcase was, but it was basically almost 2 hours of watching somebody play Apex Legends with their friends. And I'm sure there is some kind of subtext to that, but what that subtext is, I don't know. Anyway, that's pretty much all of the stuff that I got interested in at the Tokyo Game Show. As I said, things did happen in the news, and we do have to still talk about them. Elden Ring was named 2022's Best Game at the Japan Game Awards. In the awards for excellence, Elden Ring was also named, along with Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker, Ghostwire Tokyo, Horizon Forbidden West, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Lost Judgment, Pokemon Legends Arceus, Resident Evil Village, Sky, Children of the Light, and Tales of Arise. The Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry Award went to Hidetaka Miyazaki, which I suppose is only right and proper since Elden Ring did sell all of the games. And the Global Award for Foreign Product, which I can understand given the popularity, but I kind of disagree with, was given to Call of Duty Vanguard. The Game Designers Award, and this one's quite interesting, went to Inscription, and I totally agree with that. Moving on to slightly more serious news, everyone's heard of the hack of Rockstar Games for Grand Theft Auto 6 and the leak of all of that information. Well, London police have announced that they have arrested a 17-year-old over the hack, and possibly also over the hack of Uber. Now, we still don't know what the motivation was behind the hack of Uber or of Rockstar Games. Maybe it's just a desire to disseminate information that the public seems to want. Maybe it's something else. I don't know, but we will find out, so I'll keep an eye on this story for you. Moving on to another interesting story. Now, this one I haven't really seen reported in a lot of places because it seems to be one of those things that a lot of people don't really want to talk about. And it links directly to tribalism in video games, which I have heard some people talking about, especially in the MMO sphere. So, what's happening? Well, the Department of Homeland Security has awarded an almost $700,000 grant to terrorism and security researchers to study the cross-section of extremism and gaming. Now, when I say extremism, obviously we're talking about counter-terrorism operatives and people like that who are researching this. But I want you to consider something. Tribalism in video games is a form of fundamentalism, and that can easily be derailed and lead to something a lot more horrible. So I think that this sort of research is actually quite valuable outside the sphere of Homeland Security. It is something that maybe psychologists and psychiatrists could look into as to how do people become effectively radicalized, especially in games like MMOs. How do they become so tribal as to literally be enemies with people who play another type of game? How does that happen? What's the mechanics of that? It's a field of study that I think is going to become more and more important, almost as important as the field of study dealing with video game addiction. But as I said, we'll keep an eye on these stories and we'll let you know what the progress is. Moving on to Valve, who have launched a new Steam charts section, which I think is actually very, very helpful. The section replaces the old stats page on Steam and features real-time rankings for the top sellers and most played games, as well as a weekly chart and monthly overview of the top new releases. The new top-selling list is calculated on total revenue of each title, encompassing full game purchases, DLC sales, and in-game transactions. The chart also includes free-to-play titles and pre-orders, and if an individual DLC is selling particularly well, Valve will display that content as its own listing. According to Valve, the aim is to get a more complete picture of which games players are excited about getting into and continuing to play. Some adaptation news, Netflix have shown their first look at the Onimusha anime, and given the success they've had with Cyberpunk 2077 and with Castlevania, I know they've had some issues with other anime titles that they've had, but they've got a reasonably good background in terms of video game adaptations, so I am looking forward to the Onimusha anime. We also had the first trailer of HBO's The Last of Us. I'm hoping that it doesn't go the way of Halo and various others. My other main worry is that Pedro Pascal is getting typecast as the gruff older man character who has to accompany some kid from A to B and look after them and protect them. I hope that isn't the case because he's a very good actor, and it'd be a shame to limit his roles to just those. Anyway, that's it for this week. Let me know what you thought of the things that I've chosen as newsworthy articles and the games that I chose to focus on from the Tokyo Game Show. You can leave us a comment below with your thoughts. I am always interested in what people do think about these things. I'll be back on the next episode of Gosu News. Until then, thanks for watching.